The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who set me over you as a judge or arbitrator?" And then he said to the people, "Take care. Be on your guard against every form of greed, because one's life does not consist in the in the abundance of possessions." And then he told him a parable. There was once a rich man with a farm that produced abundant crops. And he thought to himself, "What should I do? I do not have enough space to store my crops. This is what I'll do," he said. "I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and then I will gather all my grain and my goods into them. Then I will say to myself, 'So you have many good things stored up for years to come, so take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is demanded of you, and who will get all that you have prepared?' So it will be with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich with God." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord. Please be seated and pray with me. Oh God, we have gathered here in front of your open word and ask that your Spirit may carry it deep into our lives so that we may be transformed closer into the image of the Word made flesh. In 1964, there was a Broadway musical about a poor Russian milkman named Tevye. And in it, Tevye said, "Dear God, you made many, many poor people. I realize it's no shame to be poor, but it's no great blessing either." And he said, "So what would have been so terrible if I had a small fortune?" And then he began to sing, "If I were a rich man, all day long I'd viddy-viddy-vum, if I were a wealthy man." And he ended it by saying, "Lord, you made the lion and the lamb. You decreed I should be what I am. Would it destroy some vast eternal plan if I were a wealthy man?" It seems that almost everybody wants to win the jackpot, the lottery, wants to be wealthy. Almost everyone. And in our gospel reading today, it begins two brothers that are fighting about the inheritance, and they ask Jesus to settle their dispute, in essence, to judge whose greed was right. And of course, he declines. That's not the reason he came. And he turned around and he said to the crowd who was around him, and he said, "Be careful about every form of greed, because your life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And then he told him a parable. It was not a parable about possessions per se, but about the abundance of possessions. He said, "There was once a rich man with a farm," so the guy was already rich. "And the farm produces a bumper crop. And the farmer says to himself, 'What should I do? Because I do not have enough room in my barns,'" not plural barn, but barns, "to store all of this produce." That was his first mistake. He thought to himself. In essence, he was worshiping what's been called the unholy trinity: me, myself, and I. So he decides, "I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger barns, and then I will gather all my grains and my goods into them." Well, that was his second mistake. He gave no thought to giving thanks to God for the abundance of his crops. He gave no thought to sharing any of the produce with the poor who live around him. And he had no thought about the even poorer who not only had no abundance, but they had no farm. That was his second mistake. But he then said, and then I'll say to myself, self, you have stored up goods and produce for many years to come. So relax. Take it easy. Enjoy life. Eat, drink, and be merry. He remembered the words of Ecclesiastes, who said, a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. But he forgot the words of the prophet Isaiah, who in chapter 22 said, eat and drink, because tomorrow we shall die. He had forgotten those. And then God said, you fool. God didn't say, you sinful man, you corrupt man, you evil man, you fool. And in the Bible, that term is usually applied to someone who does not acknowledge the existence of God, as this man certainly did not. He thought to himself. He made plans for himself. He congratulated himself. His whole life was about the unholy Trinity, me, myself, and I. Several centuries after Jesus told this parable, St. Augustine wrote about it. And he said, the rich man did not realize that the bellies of the poor were safer storerooms than the man's barns. The bellies of the poor were safer storerooms than the bellies of the man's barn. It was true then, and it's true before that. Imagine with me going to visit the farmer's widow the week after his funeral. So we get to the house, and it's somewhat smaller than we expected, and the barns are bulging with produce. We go into the house, and we ask the widow, tell us about your husband. What was he like? And she said, oh, he was a good man. He worked hard. He was in the fields all of his life. His work was his life. It was everything, and it consumed him. And she said he never was able to relax and enjoy any of the proceeds of his farm. She said a few weeks ago, when he realized that he was going to have a bumper crop, I said to him, maybe now you can relax. Maybe now we could travel, or maybe add a room on our house, or maybe another bathroom. Maybe you could share some of that produce with the workers that have worked for you all of these years. And he said, oh, I do want to do all those things, but not yet. First, I have to build bigger barns, and then maybe we can begin to enjoy life. And she began to cry, and she said, then. That word summarized his life. There was always something that needed to be done. And she said, and now there's no more then. It was true then, and it's true now, that greed for more, especially more material possessions, is like a hunger that cannot be satisfied. Years ago, when J.P. Morgan was the richest man in the world, he was near the end of his life, and someone said, J.P., how much is enough? And he said, oh, a little more than I have. At the end, God is not going to ask us, how much do you have? But may well ask us, how did you use the resources I gave you? Jesus began this parable by saying, life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. And he ended it by saying, so it will be with those who store up treasures for themselves and are not rich with God. Now, we understand what he meant by storing up treasures for themselves, but what does rich with God mean? It has nothing to do with things, the stuff that fills our attics and our basements. For some of us, our garages. There are not a whole lot of things that the comedian George Carlin said that could be repeated in church. But he did say this, that's spot on for this sermon. He said, stuff is important. Men have stuff in their pockets, women have stuff in their purses. He said, you got to have a place for your stuff. That's what life is all about, trying to find a place for your stuff. That's all a house is, a place to keep your stuff. And now you got a house full of stuff. And even though you might like your house, you got to move. You got to get a bigger house. Why? Too much stuff. And that means you got to move your stuff or put some of your things in storage. Storage, he mocks us. Being rich with God has nothing to do with material possession. Nothing. Being rich with God is a way of describing a relationship with God. Years ago, a man named George Beverly Shea sang with Billy Graham for many years, and he sang a song about one's relationship with God and the way it affects relationships with material things. And this text was sort of the polar opposite of the attitude of the rich farmer and of Tevye, who all he wanted was a small fortune. So Shea sang, I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather be his than have riches untold. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or land. I'd rather be led by his nail-pierced hand than to be the king of a vast domain and be held in sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. Who is really rich? It's a person with that kind of a rich relationship with the God that we know through Jesus. But there's a caveat with that. How do you develop a relationship? What does that require? It requires spending time with someone, right? And if our days begin with turning off the alarm, dressing, checking the weather, and checking our emails, getting the kids ready and off to school, getting to the metro in time to go downtown for our work, doing our work, getting back to the metro in time to get home for dinner and to see the kids, having dinner, preparing a couple of things for work tomorrow, watching the 9 o'clock news, and then doing the same thing again tomorrow? What's the chance that we will develop a rich relationship with God if we live like that? Zero. Most people will never have the opportunity to become materially wealthy, but every one of us has the opportunity to develop a rich relationship with God. And at the end, when we have to leave all our stuff, a rich relationship with God is the one thing that we will take with us into the life with Him after this. And it is the only treasure that we ever truly have.